The Spanish-American War, 1898, was fought between Spain and the United States over the question of independence for Spanish colonies in Cuba and the Philippines. To many historians, this was the genesis of American imperialism.
The Spanish rule in the Latin America, in the New World as a whole, was very sluggish because Spain was one of the earliest colonizers and they had a feudal mode of operation. And they kept a governor who was virtually free, a typical Oriental despot, and he did not have to bother about the command from the mother country headquarters. So because he got so much of rope, he abused his power. And he actually exercised some kind of tyranny over people under his charge. In Cuba, the same thing happened.
The First War of Cuban Independence, known as the 10 Years' War, had ended with the Treaty of El Zañón in 1878. When the Spanish government failed to implement many of the promised reforms, the Cubans revolted again in 1895 under the inspired leadership of Cuban patriot José Martí. To put down the rebellion, the Spanish government sent more than 100,000 troops into the island. General Valeriano Weyler y Nicolau, known as the Butcher for his ruthless suppression of earlier revolts, was sent to the island as the Captain General and military governor. He immediately rounded up the peasant rebels and put them in concentration camps in or near garrison towns. Thousands died of starvation and disease. The brutality of Butcher Weyler aroused great indignation in the United States. Sensational press reports on Spanish atrocities, inspired particularly by William Randolph Hearst, the publisher of the New York Journal, and Joseph Pulitzer, the publisher of the New York World, not only fanned public passion, but also called for intervention by the United States on the side of the Cubans. The public sensation over the Cuban Revolt coincided with mounting government efforts to extend American influence overseas in order to extend the market for trade.
This war was in the trajectory of United States foreign policy. They had been itching for a war for expansion overseas. The American capitalists for a long time had been investing in Cuba, particularly in its sugar cane and also tobacco plantations. It's a very huge stake because the estimated investment was $1 billion per year. And therefore, the US government was very much interested in protecting the interest of the capitalists and also for expansion.
The US government sent the second-class battleship Maine to Havana Harbor on request of the US Consul General. This was ostensibly to protect American citizens and property in Cuba. But on the night of February 15th, the Maine was destroyed by an underwater explosion and 266 persons, including officers and sailors, were lost. Exactly how and why the explosion occurred could not be determined at the time. But many people in the United States believed the Spaniards were responsible.
The Cuban people were smarting under the oppression of the Spanish governor. So much was oppression that there was a revolt led by one leader, a Spanish Cuban leader Jose Marti against Spanish misrule. The matter would have ended there. It would have been something of an internal crisis between the Spanish ruler and the revolt led by Jose Marti. But then Jose Marti sent an appeal to the US government for intervention in their interest. US government was looking for this kind of an invitation. They readily accepted that and prepared for war. And at that time, the US president was Theodore Roosevelt, who was a jingo himself. He was an ex-naval officer, Assistant Secretary of the Navy in the previous government, and therefore he wanted war to show his prowess. And they raised the slogan, Cuba Liber, that is, liberation of Cuba.
Excuse me, sir. So the crisis in Cuba, is it only internal or also created by America?
This is an internal crisis, but externalized by United States. They readily grabbed this opportunity to intervene, not for so much for the Cuban people, but really for the interest of the tycoons of United States. So that was the main motivation behind US intervention.
In fact, in order to justify her intervention in Cuba, the United States raised the issue of independence of the Philippines too. Actual hostilities lasted less than 4 months, from the 25th of April to the 12th of August 1898. On the 22nd of June 1898, 15,000 US soldiers landed southeast of Santiago de Cuba. The troops engaged and defeated Spanish land forces on the 1st of July at the city's outer defenses at El Cane, Kettle Hill, San Juan Hill, and Las Guasimas. Meanwhile, the US naval forces blockaded the harbor of Santiago de Cuba. When the Spanish ships tried to cross the blockade, they were pursued by US naval vessels. The majority of the Spanish vessels were either sunk or made to run aground. At the end of the war, Cuba was placed under US protection, and the Philippines were bought by the US for $20 million. It marked the end of Spain's colonial empire and the emergence of the United States as a global military power.
Theodore Roosevelt reports himself that it was not much of a war. It took about 3 days to conquer Cuba. And he himself says that it's not much of a war. It was a knife through butter. Hot knife through butter, to be more correct. So that's what he did. And the rebels thought that they had been liberated, but to their dismay they found that it was simply replacement of Spanish rule by the American rule. And then we have to question the motivation of USA also. They ostensibly they said that they were for capital. So that was the thrust.
So the Cuban people were not saved from the crisis situation?
No, they were saved from the crisis situation, but they found that they did not get the liberty that they wanted. Ultimately, they were a subject people. And it's also clear that though USA applied all the norms of government into the colony, they had some semblance of democracy, some semblance of franchise, some semblance of human rights. They had all these features of American democracy also planted in the colony. But as I said, I repeatedly said, it was a semblance. That is, it was not really fully implied. The people enjoying these rights in the mainland was different from people enjoying these rights in Cuba. There was a difference between the ruler and the ruled. That was very much there. So this was this kind of a thing, and it becomes a colony. Not only that, it becomes integral to the mainland. Not only politically or territorially, it also becomes integrated in the economy itself. It becomes typically a colony once again. So that is there. It's by and large an US colony. That was very clear. And this easy success, actually, was never dreamt of by Theodore Roosevelt. He thought there would be a lot of war, but there was not war, not much war. And therefore he was flushed with success. And as a result, he began parading the strength of the United States in other regions. He revived the Monroe Doctrine, which was lying dormant for a long time. Monroe Doctrine was essentially a doctrine of isolation, and it was very pacific to start with. But at this stage, in 1898, it had become very aggressive, very bellicose, very expansionist in the hands of Theodore Roosevelt. And Theodore Roosevelt applied this doctrine now in its new version, new incarnation, into other places. They already, it has been applied before him by McKinley and Cleveland in the areas like Haiti, Samoa, Hawaii. Now, he applied it to Panama.
The Panama Canal was an international waterway jointly managed by the UK and the USA. This was enshrined in the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty of 1850. But President Roosevelt insisted that this canal should be controlled by the United States only. And for that, he issued what is known as the Roosevelt Corollary.
Roosevelt Corollary, which was a tissue of the white paper on foreign policy of the White House. And he got away with this kind of unilateral assertion. And UK couldn't register any protest whatsoever. And he wanted to consummate this by a Panama Conference, which was also held during this period in 1901. In this conference, he said that he was making the world safe for democracy, that he was reviving the new hemisphere idea of freedom and democracy. But very few people were there in that part of the world, in Central America and Latin America, to buy his ideas, because they are seen through the game. They didn't like that the powerful neighbor should act as big brother at this stage. So the new hemisphere idea did not click. So it fell through. And United States was dubbed as a neo-imperialist. And Monroe Doctrine was so much discredited since then that in future applications also, it was decried, and finally a nail was driven into the coffin of Monroe Doctrine in the Montevideo Conference in 1938, followed by the Greenland Conference in 1940. So there's a positive decline of the Western Hemisphere idea, as beautifully written by Whitaker. Between Theodore Roosevelt and the coming of Woodrow Wilson, there was a gap of a decade. During this period, the United States only tried to legitimize their gain and also to consolidate their territories for their own nationalistic purpose, which was done very efficiently. Because Woodrow Wilson was the sage of the White House, who was given to idealism and who wanted really the good of the people of the world at large. That was his policy. He announced it as a program of new freedom. And new freedom was a variation of the progressive program. In new freedom, he not only wanted to ensure the basic liberties of the American people as such, and the improvement of agriculture, not just industry, and to decentralize the American economy as far as possible. He wanted to smash the trusts as far as possible so that people's liberty could be ensured, economy could be decentralized, and home industries could once again sprout. So that was his program. And with regard to that, he extended his operations to the world stage. The Americans participated in the First World War by men, money, and material. And they were very keen to occupy some place in the world stage. And without American support, the Allied bloc couldn't have won the war against Germany. It is this US factor that clinched the issue in favor of the old powers like England, France, Austria, and others, and Spain. Otherwise, Germany would have completely swamped them. But that did not happen. The powerful Germany under Kaiser William II got defeated in the First World War, and then the Versailles Conference was called in 1918. Purpose of Versailles Conference was to checkmate Germany as far as possible, so that it could be so crippled that in future Germany couldn't rise again. That was the intention. But when Woodrow Wilson came, he thought that this was very, very severe and savage. Germany should not be in this way crippled by the other powers. And he also spoke of the principle of self-determination for the colonized people. He was speaking his idealism as a sage. In doing that, he floated what is known in history as 14 points. In these 14 points, once again, he was talking of democracy, of people's freedom, of principle of self-determination, the end of colonialism, freedom of all these erstwhile colonized countries in Asia and Africa, and also in Latin America. So all these things were there in the 14 points. But when it came to vote, somehow or other, the astute politicians of Europe, particularly Lloyd George or Clemenceau and others, they rejected the 14 points. And nothing was carried out. When Woodrow Wilson saw that he was left in the cold, he came back home. And a journalist reported, contemporary journalist reported, that all that we got out of this war was out.
So, sir, why was not Wilson admitted to the corridors of power?
Well, the situation was like this. The old powers, they were much more astute and cunning. And they already had a tacit alliance amongst them. So no newcomer would be tolerated. It's a charmed circle. And they also thought that European affairs should be managed by Europeans. There should be no American intervention in the European matters. So they wanted to block the way of United States into the European arena. That they wanted. And United States was never taken a partner of the alliance. This is because they only wanted to utilize US resources. And USA, after all, was very naive in political matters, in foreign policy matters in those days. So it was like that only. So 14 points were not carried out. He came back empty-handed home. And the world powers triumphed over him. But then the question arises, then why did United States join the First World War after all? Here we have the interpretation of George Kennan in his book, American Diplomacy. In that, George Kennan says that United States had no way but to join the First World War. It was a prompting of the American capitalist lobby and the military hardware lobby to go get into the war. War itself is a bonanza, so to say. And United States wanted to take advantage of this bonanza. Not that USA was invited by the other powers. She thrust herself into the position because they wanted to grab this bonanza as far as possible. And therefore United States had a big stake because they had supplied war material, they supplied other merchandise, cereals, and most of all, they had supplied capital, money. Money they had supplied. And they wanted return of this money from the participants in the Allied bloc. And for this reason, because America wanted her money back, she was called Cruel Uncle Sam. And Sam was equated with Shylock. So Uncle Sam was Shylock at the same time. But nevertheless, United States used a pile driver, this crew, for getting the money, and other countries shunned USA altogether. But that's why, the Richard Hofstadter in his book American Political Tradition and the Men Who Made It, in his chapter on Woodrow Wilson, says that people think that Woodrow Wilson was an idealist fool, wise fool, and he was willy-nilly put into the World War. But that is not the reason. He was not simply catapulted into the First World War. The internal factors pushed him into the First World War. So he was a pragmatist, actually. Only thing that he missed out was that he was not recognized as a world power by the entrenched powers that be. That was true, but it doesn't mean that he was innocent or ignorant of the whole matter. His economic mission was successful, but his political or diplomatic mission was a failure, because it was a scramble for power, scramble for leadership. In that leadership, an adolescent nation didn't have a place. That's why USA was thrown out. But that is because it was not, we can't say that he has drawn a blank sheet. He got his economic points all right, but the political points were not carried out. But looking at the whole episode, after so many years, we are in the 21st century now, his principles still hold good. 14 points are cherished in the history of world diplomacy. And India has also followed some of these basic principles, like the non-alignment idea of Pandit Nehru, which at that time didn't sell, but it sells today and makes sense today. So 14 points also make sense today. So that is the legacy of Woodrow Wilson. The whole thing was not, after all, a cry in the wilderness.
In this episode, Dr. Chittobroto Palit has dwelt upon the different phases of the USA's emergence as an imperial power. He identified the Spanish-American War as the testing ground for the United States' move towards imperialism. Then, he discussed how Theodore Roosevelt expanded the meaning of the Monroe Doctrine for isolationism to expansionism, referring to it as the Roosevelt Corollary. This was propounded in order to establish total control over the Panama Canal. Dr. Palit then described how all these territorial gains were legitimized and consolidated in the name of making this world safe for democracy. The United States of America was now bold enough to also declare that she wanted to establish her hegemony over the American continents. The professor finally discussed how President Woodrow Wilson propounded the theory of new freedom for making the world safe for democracy. This was presented at the Versailles Conference as 14 points. Professor Palit thinks that although this document was an important cornerstone of America's imperialist designs, it may still have something to guide peace-loving democratic nations.